supports Why Wednesday in Conversation. And today my guest is Rich Wallace. And I hope many of you know Rich Wallace. And if you don't, you need to. And we're going to talk a little bit about Rich's career as a writer in general and as a writer of young adult fiction and young adult nonfiction more recently. Still to one of my favorite books that I've read and reviewed over the years is Blood Brother, that he and his wife Sandra wrote. And I think from my own history of growing up in the civil rights movement and being aware of some issues, but not as many as I should, the missed story of Jonathan Daniels was a real pleasure to find, Rich. And maybe we start with that and start talking about how that book kind of became a passion project for you and Sandra.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, great to be with you again. I haven't seen each other in a couple years, but we
Yeah.
go pretty far back. Yeah, Blood Brother, story of Jonathan Daniels. Well, Sandra, my wife, Sandra Neil Wallace, who's also a very prolific writer. We've collaborated on a number of things. That I think was the second book we actually wrote together. We moved to Keene, New Hampshire about 14 years ago, a nice college town in New England. And we kept hearing that name, Jonathan Daniels. I'd never heard of him before. You'd go to historical society events and you'd hear his name, and it was a school named after him. We started digging into that and just finding this remarkable young man who grew up in Keene, New Hampshire, went to the high school here, was kind of a troublemaker, not a troublemaker, but he was a guy who was always in a bit of trouble, teenage kind of trouble. And then he made this decision to go to VMI. His family had a military background, and he went there and made significant changes in the way that recruits to VMI were treated. And then he entered the Episcopal Seminary. He always wanted to be a, a pastor. But the remarkable thing about him was that when he was in the seminary, he was following the news, and Bloody Sunday happened.
Yeah.
John Lewis leading the people across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, getting beaten by state troopers. And Martin Luther King that night was saying, we need seminarians and preachers from the North to come stand with us down here. And Jonathan and a couple other seminarians from in Boston got on a plane that night or the next night, I forget which, and he was on the ground in Selma basically for the rest of his life, because he was murdered by a kind of a semi-deputy sheriff in outside of Selma 6 months later, because Jonathan was involved in helping or just recruiting Black people, most of them sharecroppers, to vote. And that was a dangerous thing for people to do, especially in Lowndes County, Alabama in 1965. So
it's
Jonathan
a
is
fascinating story, and
Yeah.
you guys tell it so well with great photography in the book and connections to people like Stokely Carmichael. People who know names don't realize the connection that Jonathan Daniels had to some of these people. And fascinating work. And I know I've heard
Jonathan and Stokely were working together, but they were friends, but they didn't see eye to eye on everything. They were certainly, knocking heads together as well. But yeah, go ahead. You had another comment.
Yeah, I think that's the fascinating thing about all of that is that as much as we think we know our past, we don't know our past, right? There's lots of things to mine and explore. And you and Sandra have done that in a couple of other books as well, where you take on issues that we just don't know enough about as we need to. The Teacher's March. Yeah,
What
go
we
ahead.
try to do as historians is find the people involved, not just the facts. But here in Keene, New Hampshire, there were people who went to kindergarten with Jonathan Daniels. His best friend, lifelong friend, happened to pass away just a year ago, but we got to know him very well. And he's the one who told us the stories of Jonathan Daniels, breaking into a church at night just to go up and sit in the steeple, not to cause any damage, just to look over the town while he smoked his cigarette at 12 years old and just ponder who he was in life. And there were so many people like that in Keene, such a great archive at Keene State College, which is like right across the street from where I'm sitting right now, and the Historical Society of Cheshire County. They had Jonathan's letters and diaries and all kinds of testimonies from people who knew him. And then once felt that we'd, covered the ground here in Keene, the logical place to go was Selma. And we spent a
Yeah.
lot of time in Selma. Sandra had a T-shirt with Jonathan's picture on it, and we're walking around Selma, and people are saying, "I knew that guy."
Yeah.
Well, tell us about him, and we did dozens and dozens of interviews with people who knew Jonathan, who'd worked with him, and every conversation we had always led to, you got to call, Stephen, or you
Yeah.
got to call Betsy, other people who knew him and had other great stories about him, and had just, had gone through that whole 6 month period with him in Selma.
Yeah. It's great. Well, tell us a little bit about how you became a writer, and then how you
Mhm.
became a writer. Because first, people need to know you're one of the great writers of young adult sports fiction. I mean, some of your books are really well respected and came out at a time when there weren't a ton of people doing it. So, how did you get to be the writer you are?
Yeah, you're right. Wrestling Sturbridge is a sports book, my first one, got a lot of attention. I'll backtrack from that a little bit, but yeah, that's a sports novel kind of from the inside out.
Yeah,
There's lots of sports action in it, but it's basically, if I were a 17-year-old guy in that situation in a small town in Pennsylvania, a big, bleak little town where, the wrestling team drives everything, and you're just off the varsity and this is your last chance. So but there's sports action in it, but it's all internal. It's a monologue. The whole
yeah,
book is a first person monologue. And from a guy who really says almost nothing other than what you read on the page, he's not very conversational.
yeah,
So, but back to your question, I started writing comic books when I was in about third grade. I went up in the attic of my grandparents' house in Kearney, New Jersey, and I discovered these really well illustrated, well written comic books that my uncle had done when he was a young teenager. And they weren't funny comic books; they were like adventure books and things like that. But they were heavily illustrated, and they were the standard 6 panel on a page kind of comic books. And I said, well, I think I can do something like that. So I tried my hand at it, mostly stick figures. But anyway, that was like my first venture into writing some fiction. Um, then there was a gap, for to most of middle school, high school. I wasn't that much of a reader. I was heavily involved in sports myself. Got to college, didn't quite know what I wanted to do as a career. Knew that I wanted to run track and cross country, and that's why I was in college. And then, started taking creative writing classes, short story, poetry. And then I guess my junior year, the ultimate creative writing class at Montclair State College, where now university where I was going to school, was a novel writing class. And it was basically a workshop. There were 5 or 6 students and a professor, and the assignment was come in with a new chapter every week. So I started writing a novel then, and over the course of the next 10 years or so, I should say my next year, I did an internship at a new daily newspaper. So I was
yeah,
covering some local news and some local sports and writing a lot of obituaries and that sort of thing. And that got me into a field where I was writing and editing every day for the next 7, 8 years or so. When I had spare time, I would work on that novel that I'd started in college. By the time I was about 30 or so, I had a draft that I was ready to send out. By then, I'm working at a Highlights for Children magazine as an editor. I had made the transition from newspapers to kids magazines. And through Highlights, I was starting to meet other editors in the field who were not magazine editors or book editors. And so I submitted that novel to a couple of publishing houses, and I started getting good feedback. Sometimes confusing feedback because you'd hear one thing from one editor and one thing from another. I probably wrote that book about 4 times and then sent it to um, Tracy Gates, who was at Knopf at the time, who had seen the book earlier and
Oh,
liked it a bit and had sent some comments that were positive. And I said, that's somebody I should reconnect with when I feel better about this novel. In the meantime, I'd written Wrestling Sturbridge, which I knew was a far better book. It was just tighter. It just had a through storyline. It had the plot. It was really more compelling. It was just tighter. You know, the one way to learn how to write a novel, the best way to learn how to write a novel is write one and then write another one and then write another one. So
yeah.
Wrestling Sturbridge was actually the third novel I'd written, but the first one that really hit. Okay, so I sent both novels to Tracy Gates, knowing that Wrestling Sturbridge was really a superior one, and she took it, and that really launched the career. She was able to get, back of the book comments from Chris Crutcher, from Robert Lipsyte, from Robert Cormier, and it was like, "Ooh, this is pretty cool." And by the time the book came out, it got great reviews and an astonishing number of reviews. It was reviewed in everything from 17 magazine to the New Yorker, and I'm like, "Oh, am I just really lucky here, or am I really good, or whatever?" Because those are not the sorts of things you expect from a debut novel. So that really launched me in a way that was unexpected and not very typical either, I have to admit. So the next novels were not easier to write, but I guess I had a higher level of confidence. And
Yeah.
and I'm still working, by the way, through all of this full time as an editor of Highlights for Children. And in fact, by that time, I think I was running the magazine editorially. And so I was writing these novels late at night. I had two young boys.
Yeah.
Um, they were, you know, uh, in the best possible way, very demanding of my time. And so I was doing my writing like from 11 o'clock at night till 2 o'clock in the morning, very happily doing that, working a full-time job, eventually coaching their sports teams, and just, not having a lot of other free time, but really devoted to the writing. Um, it was probably after I had written 5 or 6 YA novels that I said, this the same editor, Tracy Gates, I'd like to write some middle grade fiction. So I proposed a series of really sports novels. These were sports driven novels for middle grade kids. It was called The Winning Season. We did
Yeah.
four. We did four, and then we did 6 more because the four did really well. They were all set in urban New Jersey, kind of like where I grew up, and it was a revolving group of characters, and they had something of a formula to them, but there was a lot of personal stuff in them, but there was a lot of sports action, probably more sports action than in any of my YA books that were, the wins and the losses were important, but really what was going on inside the head was
Of the
what was
character. Yeah.
driving those novels, all of them. Yeah.
That's
So,
that's great. So, and through those, you kept working at Highlights as well. You didn't you stayed with Highlights quite a while.
well, what happened was after the first 4 books in Winning Season came out, the the offer for the next 6 was high enough that I said, I can drop to part-time status at Highlights. I can afford to do that because this contract's going to sustain me for a while. And so I stepped down as the top editor at Highlights, but stayed on the staff, half time. And very, very grateful to Highlights for having that opportunity. I still work for Highlights. I mean, many, many years later, this morning I spent 3 hours working for Highlights for Children. I don't do a lot, but I do some consulting for them. And so backing up again, I'm in a position now where I'm um, writing more full time, not exactly full time, but much closer to it, and putting in about 20 hours a week at Highlights, which was, nice for cash flow. And I always wanted to keep that connection. And as I said, I have kept that connection for going on 40 years now. So
So yeah, I when you came out, I think, Wrestling Sturbridge is what, late 90s, I think came out, is
It
when it
was
came out.
96 or 7.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
So
that's when they were saying YA is dead.
yeah,
That's all I kept hearing. And then there was an immediate revitalization. It certainly wasn't just me. Laurie Halse Anderson, there were so many people who came out with really strong YA books at the time. And now all of a sudden it was like front and center again, which
yeah.
was,
I,
you know,
I I would say that, the real renaissance of growth probably happened through that first decade of this century, from
mhm,
2000 on. I think there were hints of it before, but like you say, Laurie Halse Anderson has Speak. We can start listing a whole group of African American authors who started getting published. They weren't just relying on, um, you know, Walter D. Myers anymore, or some of the others that they'd relied on. All of a sudden, you get people writing quite a bit more. Jacqueline Woodson starts writing young adult instead of children's only, um, and you get Christopher Paul Curtis. There's a lot of
mhm,
them, and I
sure.
think
Yeah,
Crutcher is also hitting his stride.
very
I
much
think
so.
some of his best stuff is coming out then. Yeah, I think you're right there. So were you aware of the YA publishing world and kind of knew it because you were connected with highlights and writing for children, or was it also a new genre that you kind of had to explore and pay attention to?
It was kind of new in that what I knew of the YA market in the 80s, early 90s were problem novels.
Yeah,
As a kid who's on steroids or somebody who's suffering with an eating disorder, whatever, that was there were vehicles to explore those issues rather than something that was just um, more character driven, I guess I would
yeah,
say. And not to demean any of that stuff, but that was my impression of it at the time. I think when I first started writing that first novel, I didn't even know what YA was. I was just writing a novel, and I started writing that novel at about age 21. So I mean, I didn't have a whole lot of retrospective, time in my life there to look back at things. I was writing what was fresh in my head. Even wrestling Sturbridge. I mean, I guess I was um in my early 30s when I wrote that, but I didn't feel that much removed at the time from being a teenager, which was important. It was very important that I could reconnect. I could put myself back in that mindset of that teenage angst very easily at the time. I don't think I could do that today.
yeah. That I think sometimes, yeah, that was me. My last 3 or 4 years of teaching, um, teachers, I started thinking, okay, I'm far enough removed now that what I'm doing is just an old guy talking, right? They might really need somebody who's more connected. And I was in the classroom a long time before I jumped to university,
Yeah,
25 years. But
right.
after 14, 15 years at higher ed, I thought, I think it's a slightly different world now, and maybe
Mhm.
we need some other voices doing it. Not that experience can't be relevant, but I think you're right. I think when you're trying to put yourself in that position, each year becomes a little more difficult trying to do that.
Yeah, and I think also after writing about 7 YA novels, I had wrung all that out of my system, so that's when I turned toward writing much more middle grade fiction. So,
Yeah,
and then, not much long after that time, I met Sandra, and she was an ESPN announcer. She was on TV every day, but she was really getting tired of that life where she was on the road constantly. She was in a different city every day almost. And she was writing for kids, starting to write. She hadn't published yet, but she did start publishing a lot of magazine pieces in Cricket and Cobblestone. There was a Men's
oh,
Health teenage magazine for a while. She published in highlights, and then little by little, start was sending out her manuscripts, and so it was a while that we were together, that we were writing independently, and then Carolyn Yoder, who's a fantastic editor of American fiction, American history, that we both knew quite well, was kind of, goading us into writing together. And we took that leap, I don't know, 10 years or so ago, and that's been very productive too.
No, it's been very productive, and her career has been really interesting for me to watch. I think I was one of the first people to read Muckers and read
Uh-huh,
it,
yeah.
and look at it, and then what you guys have done with, you know, Teacher's March, Bound by Ice, First Generation. Those books are all, I think, really good glimpses of nonfiction. And then Sandra's done some stuff with others and illustrators that we might consider more children's, although I keep finding reading what people call children's books really rewarding, right, as an adult.
Oh, yes, Sandra's nonfiction. I mean, they're not using those just in, lower elementary school at all. I
Right.
mean, she has done some terrific nonfiction picture books with Brian Collier, a couple of them, a big award
Yep.
winner, Orbis Pictus for Between the Lines, and a book on Diane Nash just came out. She and Brian have a number of projects coming up together too,
Oh, good.
which is great, and others. She's doing about a picture book or two a year right now.
Wow.
He is the
That's
hardest worker I've ever known in my life in any field. So yeah.
well, your contribution's been plenty. You look back to your, you know, childhood and your own personal reading and your own experience with sports. Do you think that the young adult sports novel has has reached its peak? Is there more room for it? Do we view sports differently now? With, I mean, in the old days, we used to play a lot of sports on the street. We'd play baseball on the street or kickball or pickup
Yeah.
games, and now sports seem so scripted for a lot of kids. I wonder if the experiences that you write about, that Crutcher writes about, that John Ritter write about, if those experiences of just playing sports have become so commercialized or codified, that are we going to experience a different kind of sports novel now? Or what do
We
you think
probably
about that?
probably will. I mean, I have to say, I kind of my my last YA novel kind of coincided with the beginning of like dystopia and vampire novels. That goes way back, but I mean the field has changed a lot since then even. But I won't say I felt like there was no room for me in YA. I felt like, as I said, I'd said everything I was going to write of any real value. I do think sports has changed significantly, and it's funny that you bring that up. I'm writing the insights column for the NCTE journal Voices in the Middle.
Oh,
Only
good.
one has been out yet, but there's three more to come. And um, a theme I've been writing about in every column, one very directly, is exactly what you just brought up. How, yeah, when I was a kid, I was out playing street hockey or stickball or something for, till dark every night.
Yeah.
And one thing that's changed, and it changed my kids were playing sports, youth sports 20, 30 years ago. And even then it was like everything's refereed and everybody's got, fancy soccer jerseys on, and
Yeah.
the coaches have got whistles and everything, and I did some of that as a kid, little league and junior football and all. But yeah, there's this huge limited number now of I don't see many kids out on the playground playing basketball. It's all AAU basketball tournaments
Yeah.
in St. Louis and Indiana and wherever. And I mean, literally, I know a lot of kids who are doing this right now. I've been very involved with the athletic department, especially the men's basketball team at Keene State right here, which is a very, very successful Division III program. All those guys came through AAU. All those
Yeah.
guys were heavily recruited. All those guys, great guys. Um, Different path than what I went through as a high school athlete into college, and what most are experiencing today is maybe less fun, at least when you're a kid. It's it
Yeah.
it seems that way to me. So I think something's been lost there. And yeah, I would imagine there might be some really interesting fiction that could be written from that perspective, and maybe shine a light on that might shift some minds a little bit. I don't know. I
Yeah.
know
It's
I'm not the
it's
one to do it.
Yeah, it's interesting. We have one of our sons is a professional soccer coach for club sports, and he's in
Uh-huh.
Kansas City, and he runs he's doing exactly what he wants to. He runs the recreational side youth league, right? And so he'll occasionally coach a team, but he's coaching 4 and 5 year olds.
Yeah.
And I said, "What do you like about it?" He says, "Because you could just let them play." He said, "My biggest problem are the adults, the parents, you know." And
Mhm.
he said, "If I could just get parents to be quiet, um, they could do a lot." He says, because one of his rules is you never kick the ball. He says, you don't kick the ball, you pass the ball, or you
Mhm.
stop the ball, or you
Yeah.
redirect the ball. And he says, but parents want to say, kick it, kick it, kick it. And one parent said, "Why didn't you praise my kid?" I said, well, I don't know if I was praising, if I said anything, if I was praising the kid or you coaching him. Had you been quiet, then I might have known he did something on his own, right? And I
Yeah.
thought,
Yeah.
but he's
Yeah.
kind of trying to figure out how to make it fun so that kids want to do it. So that when they wake up at 13 or 14 and say, "Oh, I have some skills and I really like this," then maybe the real coaching takes place, right? You can start doing things that are more strategic or more involved with training. But if you kick all the fun out of it from the time they're 5 until they're 12, they may not want to do
Mhm.
it, right?
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think, if kids are very interested in sports at a young age, they ought to be playing every sport in every season, or or alternating or whatever, but not just specializing. If you're specializing in ice hockey or soccer or basketball when you're 8, how much passion are you going to have for it when you're 18? I don't know,
Yeah.
you know.
Well, I'm going to pull you back to a book from about 10 years ago. I want to go to Perpetual Check because it
Hmm.
reminds me of this conversation as I just finished it not very long ago, where Zeke's the older brother,
Yeah.
the kind of the easy athlete, and Randy is the younger brother who might be a good athlete, but we never know because he could care less, right? And
Yeah.
I
They're
think
kind of, yeah. Go ahead.
yeah, I think it's a beautiful relationship because it's like one kind of embraces the father's push to be involved, and the other one says, "If you're pushing it that far, I'm not interested, right? I'm not interested." And
Mhm.
not to give anything away, but one of the conclusions in the book is that Zeke and Randy decide that they'll coach a youth soccer team together. And I really liked that moment, right? Where these
Mhm.
two brothers find um, some common ground, which has been a
Mhm.
little difficult for them, right, as they go.
There's, you know, what sparked me to write that novel was, again, something in my own life. My own two sons, who were not quite as extreme as those two, but the differences were apparent. That one was a more laid back, one was more intense. The older one was more into athletics. The other one could take it or leave it. And not at the, they're playing in a Northeast Regional Chess Championship, staying in a hotel overnight in the book.
Yeah,
But what happened in our high school, when my kids were there, the kids were 2 years apart, and the older one had won the high school chess championship as a sophomore, and the other one's there as a freshman. And they wound up playing against each other in the semifinals. And I won't give away what happens in the book because it's similar, but the it was interesting to see how that played out, because
yeah,
the older one, on the surface, there's no way this kid's going to beat me. And in reality, they were a pretty even match,
yeah,
So the the more laid back younger brother, won even if he didn't win.
yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. It's I had a brother that was 4 years younger than me that was a really good athlete, and he was taller. He's about 6'1". I'm 5'8", and I could dominate him playing basketball till he was about a seventh grader, right? And I could beat him when he could beat my friends, and they were all better players than me. So just that I was his brother had him intimidated enough that he couldn't beat
Uh-huh.
me. But most of my friends, he'd go one-on-one with them and could destroy them, because if they
Mhm.
didn't cover him, he'd shoot from outside. If they, if they gave him too much ground, he'd blow by him and take a layup. But
Mhm.
I didn't kind of realize how good he was until I watched him play some of my friends a year younger or
Uh-huh.
my age, and then I went, "Oh, you're pretty good." And had he played in the he played 1 year college and didn't like it, but had there been a 3-point shot, he probably would have played at a bigger
Mhm.
college,
Yeah.
because he could really nail them from the corners. He was just flawless, but it wasn't the same kind of game at the time, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
It changes. But I love that when I was reading that book, because again, I heard Chris Crow was talking with John Ritter once at a thing, and he said sports books can be judged by the size of the ball. The smaller
Mm.
the ball, the better the book. And I thought, and I thought about that, and I thought, what about Perpetual Check? Because it's a
Mm.
sports book without a ball, and
Yeah.
and I think,
Mhm.
geez, Rich, it's pretty dang good. It's one of those
Mhm.
books that people should know more of and read, and it made me think of what other books do I know? How many chess books are out there, right? And are there enough of them, right? Do we do we
There
look?
are, and there, at least at the time of that book come out, I discovered a lot of chess publications because they were reviewing the book.
Ah,
And that was pretty cool to see. But yeah, one of the things about writing sports books, and especially about writing a chess book, play by play can be really deadly. I mean, you need
ah,
some of it. You need to, describe the action as it's happening. But I mean, there's nothing real compelling about moving a rook forward 4 spaces. But it's again, it's what's going on in the player's mind. That
yeah,
is always what has driven my book. And that book, um, it's not told in first person, but it's alternating viewpoint. It's a
yeah,
chapter in Randy's head, a chapter in Zeke's head, and so that dichotomy becomes really clear. Um, and but I noticed, one advantage of me having been a sports writer right out of college, where I was covering, professional basketball, college football, and a lot of high school sports, was figuring out how to make, a, a 14-inch story in the newspaper compelling without just saying, the Giants beat the Cardinals, 19-7, and Phil Simms threw 2 touchdown passes. There's got to be far more to it than that, because especially in this day and age, and even back 45 years ago when I was writing sports, everybody knew what the outcome was already.
right.
You weren't giving anything away. You need to get much deeper into the players' heads and the strategy and such. So that was valuable for me to have that experience when I'm working, play by play, a little bit of it into a novel.
Oh, I read it, and I think David Class has one called Grandmaster or something like that.
Hmm.
That's pretty
Yeah.
good. But I was reading it, and when I was browsing your books, I said I didn't know he had a chess book, and so that was when I hunted around in the local libraries and was able to find it. And
I'm
and
glad you found it. It didn't sell a lot of copies, but it's still
that's
out
one
there
of,
and I'm proud of it.
yeah, oh, you should be. And that's one of those things where, as somebody who's a critic of YA, and I don't shy away from, you know, I if I don't like a writer's books, I just kind of ignore it and go on. I'm not trying to
Mhm.
sabotage anybody, but I think there's a lot of good books that are completely ignored and need some resurrection, need somebody to look at those books again. And I think that if somebody were asking me for a sports book for kids who are interested in competition and the brothers aspect, I think it's really, really good. Let's look at another hidden gem of yours, I think, because I hadn't heard of this one, is War and Watermelon, because it's another brothers book.
Yeah.
These brothers are apart in age, and it's set around 1969, and an experience to Woodstock, and maybe the driving factor is the overlooming nature of the draft of the Vietnam
Mhm.
War.
Yeah.
So tell me about the impetus for that book. What drove you to that one? And because again, we can say, are you a sports writer? Are you a YA writer? In my mind, you're just a writer of some pretty good fiction, right? So
Thanks. Yeah. Okay. So again, that book probably more than any novel I've written drew almost directly on my life. 1969 Woodstock, the year the Mets won the pennant, the moon landing, and me turning, I was 12, and having an older brother who was facing the draft. There were 7 kids in our family, so I basically
oh,
stripped out 5 of them, and it was just me. In this book, it's the narrator, or I don't even I don't is he a narrator or is he just the first person viewpoint? I forget, but um,
yeah, I think there's a little of both as it goes back and forth,
it
right?
may, yeah, I remember. It's a while back, but the main character whose name escapes me, and the older brother who is, at a point where he is out of high school and not in college, and the Vietnam War is looming. What's
Yeah,
going to happen next? And the parents are saying you got to get yourself in college, get some kind of deferment, and the older brother is resistant to that. And the younger brother is watching all this, pretty much afraid for his brother, but also going through what you go through at 12 years old.
yeah,
He's going to the local swimming pool every day, and just very awkwardly interacting with girls, having a
yeah,
friend who's a little ahead of him in that regard, and following the Mets, following the top 40 on the radio,
right.
um, and experiencing the moon landing on television, all these things that I went through leading up to Woodstock. Um, the older brother hears about this thing, and he's just like my older brother Bobby. You could have easily looked at me as the bratty younger brother, but he never did. He always included me in things. He and his girlfriend and his friends, if they were playing pool, I was down in the cellar with them playing pool. If they were riding out into the country to, do whatever, or go sleigh riding in the wintertime, I was always invited. And so I just adored my brother Bobby. I had 2 other older brothers who weren't quite as, didn't think I was quite so cool. And so my brother Bobby and his friends decided they were going to go to Woodstock. I think, like everybody else who went to Woodstock, it was like spur of the moment.
Yeah,
There's this thing happening an hour and a half up the road in New York State. Let's go. Well, a lot of them spent 48 hours on a New York State thruway.
yeah,
That was my brother Bobby's experience. I did not go. My parents
yeah.
said, no, there is no way you're taking Richie on that trip. I was Richie. Everybody in New Jersey still to this day calls me Richie. And so they never made it to Woodstock, but they kind
Uh,
of were part of the experience. But in the
yeah,
book, of course, the 2 brothers do get to Woodstock,
yeah,
and arrive in the middle of the night when Arlo Guthrie is basically shutting the show down for the night, playing, I forget the name of the song, but some Dylan song. And I retraced that path, um, along those back roads that
yeah,
my characters do take to Woodstock, and went to the grounds, and studied up on that a lot, and knew exactly who had played at what hour, and really
yeah,
when the rain had begun,
yeah,
what
yep,
what, what they would have walked by when they abandoned their car to walk the last 5 miles to Woodstock. And so I always want to have that kind of tactile experience where I've visited the place that I'm writing about. It's especially important in writing nonfiction. And in
yeah,
with 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 that book, I paid very, very close attention to what really happened in the world on those days.
yeah,
If Tom Seaver pitched a no-hitter, or two-hitter, I should say, I had to know what day that occurred and how that
yep,
related to the events, that were happening in um, Brody, is that his name?
yeah.
I
Brody's the
forget
main character.
Brody.
Yep,
What was going on in Brody's life that day while he was at junior football practice, or
yeah,
hanging out with his friends at the swim club or whatever. So knowing that, the top 40 was not reflective of what, as an adult, I would have hoped it was.
Yes.
The songs that I loved from 1969, that the top 40 was Bobby Sherman and the Archies, and it's
Yeah.
like, okay,
You
yeah,
know, when you said that Come Together, I think never got higher than number 3 on the charts.
no,
That was stunning to me because I think I can
I know,
remember, when that album came out eventually, and
yeah,
with all that, and then the Archies, I think, yeah, I remember listening to those, but certainly the ones that I re-listened to, are the Stones and
the
some of the
Bloods,
folk
yeah,
stuff.
exactly, of
And
course, yeah.
but I
So,
again, being of a certain age, we go, oh yeah, and people don't quite understand the power of listening to the radio and hoping late night they're
yeah,
going to play the things. Like I had a similar experience where I was listening to the radio late one night and somebody said, "We have a new Beatles song. I'm going to play it. I don't know if I'm supposed to be playing it." And he played "Let It Be." And and my friends wouldn't believe me for a few weeks that there was a new Beatles song, right?
wow,
But I'd
yeah,
heard it on the radio late at night where somebody had got a cut and was playing it maybe a couple of days or a few days before they were supposed to be playing it, right? These
yeah.
DJs would get these and control late at night. They could control what they played. It
Mhm.
wasn't scripted in the same way as now.
Yeah. Yeah, I listened that was like kind of when I came of age as a radio listener. That summer of 1969, I was listening to that stuff, or I'd listen to the Mets or the Yankees, and then I'd listen to sports talk radio till like 2 o'clock in the morning. I love to just lay there and listen, at that age. And I felt like I was just really starting to connect with the world then. My grandfather had given me, I think, for my 12th birthday, a radio. It wasn't like
Yeah,
a great hi-fi set or anything like that. It was just a radio. He was an electrician in Kearney, New Jersey, and also had a shop where he sold TVs and things like that. His his New Jersey electrician's license number, I've got his business card here somewhere, was like number 8 or something like that, issued in the entire state of New Jersey. When I was in high school and my first year of college after the summer, I worked for him. He was in his 70s then, but he was still doing um, smaller electrical jobs. He wasn't like wiring a whole house or anything like that anymore, but we were going back into places that he had fully wired, like in the 20s and 30s,
yeah,
and um, you know, fixing things. And so that was a great experience for me too, to see my really beloved grandfather, in a different light out there in the
yeah.
working world, and I was working with him summers. So that was really cool too.
That's really great. So what's next for you? You're still writing a little bit, and
Yeah.
um, what recommendations might you have for any new writers? you know,
Right. That's the
yeah,
thing. Yeah, still writing. What I'm doing right now, I mean, I'm still writing. I haven't attempted to do a book in a couple of years. And I'm not sure when that'll happen next. I kind of am on hiatus. I am doing still some work for Highlights for Children. I still do consulting work for some other magazines that I've been associated with for a long time. So I mentioned I'm writing that column for the NCTE Journal, but that's only a quarterly thing.
yeah,
I'm still busy every day, I will say that much. If you want to get into writing, um, again, the start that I had was at a daily newspaper when I was, a junior in college. But that was a daily newspaper with a circulation of about 65,000, and we had a sports staff of 18. If you have
wow,
a daily newspaper of that size these days, they've got one sports editor, and that's about it.
yeah,
Those opportunities barely exist anymore. But,
yeah,
but so there are other communications types of internships and opportunities out there that I would say definitely pursue. I mean, the best thing I did in college was an internship.
yeah,
That was the um, really the first semester of my senior year. That is what I did. I was considered a full-time student, but I was going to a newspaper every week,
yeah.
and
I
a
think that's
daily paper.
I know enough writers now that um my advice when people ask me, because I'm an academic or I write academically, that they think I'm a writer, and I'm not the same kind of writer. But for people who write fiction or nonfiction or, write these books, writers write. There's something
Yes. Yeah.
compelling. They get up and they write, and they have the story of the book that's still in the drawer that never got published, or the third or fourth book that's still in the drawer,
Mhm.
or the 10 drafts of something that people read and think, oh, that must have been easy to write. The simplicity
Mhm.
maybe took 10, 15 drafts. But I think writers write is probably, you're right. If you can find a way to get somebody to pay you to do it and get that experience, that's
Mhm.
probably the best.
But right. And I've always had, almost always had a job, that
Hmm.
again, cash flow is important. If you're a freelance writer, sometimes the checks are few and far between.
Yeah.
I have been one of the really fortunate YA writers who made a living at it, and it wasn't immediate, but I was able to sustain myself as a writer for a lot of years. And I recognized how rare that was, and never took it for granted. But it's I always tell people, any artistic endeavor, if you're compelled to do it, do it. When my son was growing up, my younger son, the one who won the chess match, he'd have like seven guys in his bedroom all playing the guitar, and they all thought we want to be rock stars. Well, 20 years later, my son works full time in tech, and on the weekends he plays in a rock band. You can
Yeah.
always do that sort of thing,
Right.
and I admire the hell out of people who go to open mics and read their poetry. I
Yeah.
mean, I'm not saying that that's, a career that's going to sustain you, financially, but man, it just sustains your heart to do those
Yeah.
things and do it. If there's a creative outlet or just a creative endeavor that you want to get into, there's nothing better. There's nothing better, especially if you're working a 9 to 5 job that's a little emotionally draining and not so fulfilling. Get fulfilled elsewhere. And maybe you strike it rich and something hits and it pays off. I'm one of the most fortunate people in the world that wrestling Sturbridge took off the way that it did. You
Yeah.
still get royalties on it 27 years later, so
Yeah.
it still sells. It's still my best selling book, except for some of the series books have outsold that a bit. But as a standalone novel, it's far and away
Yeah.
my best one.
Well, and it's a great novel. It's one that, when I was starting reading a lot of YA at the turn of this, century, at 2000, 2005, in those 5 years, I was trying to inhale things that I'd missed, right?
Hmm.
And getting wrestling Sturbridge and some of the other sports writers, because I was friendly with Chris Crow, and you can't be friendly with Chris Crow if you don't read sports books, right? So
It's not,
yeah,
yeah,
because he's made a pretty good living at critiquing them
yeah,
and hanging out with a lot of you guys early on. So
yes.
um, anytime I needed some direction, I'd say, "Oh, hey, Chris, what am I missing?" And here and there, and do that. But geez, Rich, it's been great to talk to you. This has been
You
really
too.
interesting to hear your perspective on the field and on writing. I wish you the best in whatever you choose to do next, whether it's another
Well,
nonfiction or you got another book in you. Love to see
yeah,
it.
oh, there'll be more. I've got plenty of energy and plenty of time. So, um, yeah, I mean, the pandemic, shifted things a bit.
Sure.
I, you know, spent much of that time walking in the woods with
Yeah.
Sandra. There wasn't a lot more you could do in the time, and I didn't feel compelled to be writing, but I still
Yeah.
feel, that I'm going to do that.
Yeah, it was, I'd been on, I used to ride a pedal bike, a bike quite a bit. And then during the pandemic, the roads in Vegas were empty where I was. And I thought, I wonder if I'm, at 65, if I will fall off my bike. So I dusted it
Mhm.
off, pumped it up, and did about 3,000 miles during the lockout.
Wow.
I just,
Mhm.
got up and would take an hour and a half and go ride the bike because all of a sudden the
Fantastic.
roads were safe. And then I
Mhm.
learned where the back roads were as traffic started coming so that I said, okay, I can still go a lot of places now that I know the roads, right? And the
Yeah.
secondary roads in the city.
I've done a lot of my writing walking or running in the woods,
Yeah.
just it's working things out in my head, and then
Yeah.
getting back and cleaning up and sitting down and writing. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, it's good. Well, thanks, Rich, for spending some time with us, and we'll see each other again.
Yes, we will. Thanks so much, Steve. Great catching up with you.